Austin, Texas. A ver.
Member at the MonkeyWrench Bookstore, and tonight I'm glad to have Bill McCarver here to give a talk. I initially came to the collective with the idea of having this in part because it's Black History Month, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about a neighborhood that has a unique history in Austin as a place where African Americans lived, and the history of displacement that's gone on there that predates much of our contemporary understanding of gentrification on the east side, and has much more to do with a sort of active role, although it's not separate from what's going on today, but a much more active role of the University of Texas and some state policy, some government policies here. Now, I have not met Mr. McCarver before 10 minutes ago, but I read his doctorate a couple years ago when I was doing research on the Blacklands, and I was looking at the University of Texas's expansion in a slightly earlier period. Most of his work focuses on the 80s and the 90s, particularly the 90s. And there were some interesting parallels that could be drawn between some of the earlier university expansions coming out of the 1960s and 70s that were framed through federal urban renewal programs, which we can talk, I don't know if you want to talk about today. But what I was immediately struck by in his doctorate was how much it was oriented to an activist framework to understanding urban space and urban change. And it was quite a refreshing read. And there was a lot of focus in his doctorate on a particular way of formulating problems around urban power, and I think it's useful. Just a few points before we start. If you have to go to the bathroom, the light to the bathroom is on the door outside. It's not inside, it's closer to you. It's not in the bathroom, it's on this wall. What else? We are a all nonprofit owned and run community bookstore. We have an email list for many events that we have. Tomorrow night we're having a Valentine's Day event, a vegan chocolate event, and a showing of the movie Chocolat. You're welcome to come to that. And there are other events which I'm not remembering. I know we have a few other things coming on. Last night we had a book signing. We have periodic events. This is an information only email about what's going on in the store. We also have a cash can. Feel free to give some money if you want to for coming here. We do need to pay to keep the electricity on and pay our rent and whatnot. So I hope that that's a decent introduction.
That's great.
And thank you very much for giving this talk.
Well, we'll see if you thank me later. Hope to work it out. Thank you for having me here tonight. I don't like to lecture. I love discussions, but I got to talk a little bit so you'll know what to ask. Although some of you have probably read a little bit about the Blackland neighborhood and what we've tried to do and what's happened to us. But the thrust of what's going on, and it still continues, you'll never get over the 1928 city master plan. And it divided all Austin into two unequal parts, and east of I-35, and then it was East Avenue, became a place where they displaced people of color from west of the Capitol, the areas that are law offices now. Clarksville neighborhood, Wheatsville neighborhood. Wheatsville's gone except for the co-op that got named for it. Those neighborhoods were predominantly black. And in the 1928 plan, Austin copied what a lot of other cities did. Memphis did it, I believe Chattanooga, and some of the northern cities just decided after World War I that they weren't going to be able to ever integrate the populations, they'd just segregate them and make it all convenient. And Austin did it for two reasons. One, the real estate was going up considerably to the west of the Capitol there, and they wanted to convert that over into upscale law offices and residential. And the other reason, they just wanted to segregate blacks and get them out of that area because it was just not good for the neighbors over there. And they were trying to, segregation was just part of the world at that point. And the other thing in the plan, though, while they would displace the black people to the area south of Manor Road, east of I-35 on down the river, they also gave the University of Texas the plan to annex in that area as well at the same time. So you have a situation where you place them in this corridor and then you push them out. And the University of Texas, that was their credo, to go east, and they cited that as late as 1990 in memos as a reason they were annexing that direction. Now, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that all those plans of segregation were racist, and they kicked them out. But it remained the hidden plan for the University of Texas to continue to move eastward. They annexed 6 times, and in 1966 they took the area over to the LBJ Library. And that was called the Wynn neighborhood. There was a Wynn Elementary School in that area. They took that, and it was a done deal before the neighborhood knew what was going on. June Brewer, who was one of the first black women to get a doctorate from the University of Texas, lived in that area. She tried to organize, but she said that before they could even begin to talk to each other about it, City Council had already voted. Emma Long, who the Long Cultural Center's named for, was the one of the council members at that time. She couldn't stop it, but she insisted that they at least try to give the people compensation for their housing. So what they did was they used urban renewal funds at that point. And one of my neighbors, Dixie Connor, who was displaced in 1966 back to the east, he said they showed up on your porch and they gave you a bus ticket and check. And you had 30 days to move. He moved about 15 blocks to the east, and he ended up in the Blackland neighborhood. A number of his neighbors did too. And that annexation, they wanted to go all the way to Chestnut Street. But urban renewal rules said that they would not be able to take an area like that unless it was 50% dilapidated and blighted. And they had very strict architectural rules for defining what blight was. Shingles peeling off a house, foundation gone, certain things that were there. And they were technical and measurable. So they found out that they could not annex any further than Comal Street. And they did up to that point, which is just east of I-35, and it's where their central shipping and receiving plant and their mailing point is today. But they want to go a lot further. They sit there and bide their time. Now, the real estate people, and you get into real estate real quick in this, they all knew that University of Texas was going to continue to encroach to the east. So what they would do, no family that wanted to raise anybody there would move into the area and buy, because they knew that at any given time the university would come back and annex. And so what happened was the realtors and speculators would go in and they'd buy up a property real cheaply, and they'd sit on it and they would rent it very cheaply. And the good news is, if you were a tenant, you had cheap rent, and the bad news was there was no incentive for the landlords to take care of the property, so you could watch the stars through your ceiling at night. It was terrible, and it was blighted. And that process created blight in the wake of the university's next annexation, and because the land was always cheaper in that area, they could always justify going east rather than north or south or any other direction, because it was just good business. But they created that blighted area. The policy created. And that continued quite a while. If you look at the process of land exchange over there, you'll find that until 2000, most of the land in East Austin was extremely depressed in value. You could buy a lot for, in the year 2000, about $8,000. Now 5 years later, that same lot would cost you $50,000 to $60,000, and now it will cost you $100,000 to $150,000. And what occurred in that time was a number of people moved in, the area became popular. It was cheap land. The pioneers over there, the gentrifiers, moved in, bought the land, built McMansions, mostly around 2005. And you can tell those 2005 to 2007 units, they all have big fences around them. And they're like cultural holes in the neighborhood. It's hard to borrow a cup of sugar through an iron fence, but that's kind of what was there. Up to that point of 2000, though, if you looked into the the black community, you'd find that those folks didn't have a lot of market for their places. And so interesting things occur. If land's not worth anything, there's no need in putting it in your will. And so a lot of the properties, when a couple would pass on, their kids would look at it and there was no will left, and so one of them would just move in and start paying the taxes. Reverend W.B. Sutherland, who used to teach at Sweet Home Church over in, or Sweet Home Church in Clarksville, he called those Lord's wills. The Lord willed that the strongest child in the family would move into that house and take over. And frequently that's what would occur, but the person had no deed to the property. So if they ever wanted to sell, if you don't have a clear deed, you can't. You'd have to get all your brothers and sisters and their kids, if they'd passed on or whatever, together and agree to sell. That's hard to do. It takes a lot of legal work, and so a lot of the land was just in clouded deeds. Well, what would occur for the real estate is that, of course, the taxes are going up, because even if your land hadn't been worth anything, when the gentrification came in and suddenly the lots are worth $50,000, $60,000 by 2005, the taxes go up too. And the folks who had moved into those houses were maybe able to maintain them and pay the old taxes, but when you kick the taxes on up, and they're already into debt right here, they go under. And they would be, the county would foreclose on them for delinquent taxes, and they'd put those properties up for tax auctions. So between 2003 to about 2007, you found numerous properties over in East Austin that were up for the tax auction. And the realtors would go down and bid it on the courthouse steps. It used to be, it was an open bid, just like an auction, and they'd stand out there and call out their bids. Then it became a seal bid to the higher bidder. And that process, what you had was a lot of historic African-American homes went under because of the taxes. They just couldn't pay the upscale taxes. Now, in a state policy, what you've got, Texas is a property state tax. A lot of other states have an income tax, and some of you have been in places where you pay $600, $1,800, $2,000 a year. The state income tax. Not in Texas. You pay a property tax in Texas. And what that does is, many of us believe that it puts an inequitable burden on low and middle income people, because they don't spend any more, or probably less, than upscale folks, but they pay just the same taxes on their property. They pay it on the land. And if there's a big Taj Mahal there, yeah, the upscale folks may pay a little more on that, but it is an inordinate burden on the poor and middle class in Texas or any other state that has property tax laws. And that's what really put a lot of the historic black families under. In the last 5 years, I've seen 8 houses go from traditional African-American families on over to upscale whites. And it has almost been a tax problem. The parents pass on. It becomes a tax sale, or it becomes a sale. Just the kids can't afford the taxes. And then there's other social issue. A lot of folks move away from home and they don't want to come back and live in the house. You know, they don't want to come back from Houston or Schenectady or whether they're gone. They want to come back to Austin and live in the house that their folks had. So it just goes on. And the gentrification is slow and it's insidious. Sometimes it's more rapid. Our neighborhood was backed into an anti-gentrification thing after we got into the battle with UT. And I want to go back to that, having explained a little bit about the real estate history in East Austin. I want to come back to, I talked earlier about the 1966 encroachment. Well, in 1980, they decided to do it again. And I just moved and purchased a house with the help of my sister, thank you, Martha, picked up a house on Manor Road, and I had 2 daughters, about yay high, trying to raise me right. And we bought in there in 1978. 2 years later, the University of Texas decided they would annex. When we bought it, the realtor, who was a really nice man, Joe Lundell, he said, you know, university might come over here at some point, but we don't know when. Of course, he knew good and well they would. He was one of the realtors that had bought a lot of land in the area, and that particular house he was disinterested in. I don't know why, but he put it on the market one day, and we bought it that day. And but 1980, we find out that we're going to be probably bulldozed by the University of Texas because they had the power of eminent domain. They could condemn property, and in the state of Texas, any of the state universities, the Aggies, the T-Sippers, Texas Southern, any of them can go out and condemn property for their own uses, and they don't even have to have a public hearing.
Really?
No. Their board can get together, their regents can get together and say, we need that land, and they can take it. Now, they got to give you market rate for it. They can't just take it. And you can protest that, kind of like Highway Department does it too, or Texas Department of Transportation now. They'll condemn land for projects, but they have to give you market rate for it. And the only recourse you have, if they're going to condemn it, you can bicker about the price, but it's not a if they're going to get it, it's just how much you're going to get for it. And you sometimes get a little more, but not that much. So in 1980, when they came across, a number of my neighbors who had been through the 1966 debacle just threw up their hands. Some of the older ones said, we don't want to go through this again, and they sold immediately and moved further east. And to black neighborhoods, they wanted to be around black people, and so they moved further east, and a lot of them were elderly and figured maybe they'd last this one out and die before the next annexation. Some of them moved into inferior homes. One house had a terrible foundation. The Taylor family moved into that one, and they were very nervous and elderly, and they really needed some advocate or a lawyer to work with them, but they didn't have that, so they just kind of bailed out and they took it in the neck. And there were others like them. The way they encroached, though, in that area and annexed, they did a demonstration north of Manor Road where the maintenance facility is now. They condemned those properties. And they went in and just took those carte blanche. But then in the south end there, in about a 16-block area, they got a realtor, a black realtor, to come in and begin to buy those, but not admit he was buying them for UT. Everybody knew that Anderson Wormley was working for UT, but he wouldn't admit it. We finally went up and used the Open Records Act and got a copy of the contract. And Mr. Anderson he had a 4% contract to buy those properties for the University of Texas, which is kind of an interesting contract. But he knew a lot of folks, and they knew him, and some of them who were afraid just sold to him immediately. Some of us didn't know him. I was one of them, and there were other folks in there that decided they did not want to move, but they were all extremely nervous because you knew the University of Texas eventually was going to take the area that they were voluntarily buying up the land. Well, what we got into was immediately there were a lot of people who were just afraid. They had seen these annexations again and again and again, and it was difficult for them to really get motivated to organize in a way. They had difficulties in getting their communication together. There was no newsletter. In fact, nobody knew it was the Blackland neighborhood except Charlie Smith, who was a deacon at the 19th Street Baptist Church, which is what MLK used to be called. And Charlie knew historically that it was Blackland, and he had a couple of neighbors around him that validated it was. So suddenly we became the Blackland neighborhood. We actually had a place and an identity. But our identity was forged in this battle with the University of Texas because most of us didn't know each other. And one of the things you get into in organizing, rarely will neighborhoods organize unless there's some encroaching, overriding burden, some threat that forces people to get out from their television sets or whatever they do at night and go in and organize. Because it's unnatural to organize in a community like that unless you have a good reason. And folks don't just say, oh, let's get together and create a neighborhood association. That rarely happens. Now with all the planning and stuff in Austin, you just about have to do it in self-defense, but it's another form of defense. A lot of the organizing was not terribly positive, but in this case it was strictly a strategy to try to survive. But there wasn't a strategy for the most part except to get a little press and let people know that a lot of folks were getting screwed. The ones who really were getting screwed were the tenants whose landlords sold immediately and they were evicted. Now the university would not evict them themselves. they said though they would not buy any property that was still occupied. So the landlord had to evict the tenants as a condition of the sale, and so it was done by the landlord, not UT. But it was a UT policy. It was absurd. Pearline Packer, they evicted her one night, and she was sitting on a curb after the constable got through, and it was raining about like it was last night, and she was just sitting out there with an umbrella and 3 kids. And they sent her, she found a place down on Perdinelli Street near the river, and no windows in the house, no water for a while. This woman was very poor. And they had all her belongings in 2 cardboard boxes, took a cab down there, and they bathed in the city. There was a city park nearby, and the kids would go out there and bathe, and that's where they got their water to cook with. That's kind of the conditions that went on. They got no expenses for being evicted, no relocation costs at all. They bore the whole burden. When Mr. Worrells, George Worrells was 82 and had a very bad heart condition, and when the university came in and they were going to evict him, he had a stroke and died. We called the Office of Real Estate Development and begged them to wait 3 days before they actually threw his nephew out, who was taking care of him, to let him at least do the funeral. And they did. They're very gracious about that. Those were the kind of atrocities that went on. They were very inhumane. But the university policy was put together by one of the vice presidents for business affairs, who had the demeanor of somewhat of an undertaker. And he used words like, a prudent person knows not to purchase property near a large institution. And in other words, it was our own dadgum fault if anything happened here. And that was his attitude. And what we did in the press, though, we loved to get him in front of the cameras because he didn't come off very well. And we would try to get some of the neighbors to go in and talk in real terms, with genuine feelings. And we came off pretty good on the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news because we were real and he was plastic. And that helped, but we fought them for 3 years. We were winning in the press just really well, but they were still purchasing land. And they were eating us up. Slowly we were losing out. So we had a model, though, and John Henneberger had started a nonprofit in the Clarksville neighborhood, I believe 1977 or 6. And that nonprofit had started building housing over there, and that was an area where there were a few black people remained from after the 1928 plan. Enough of them hung on to their land, they created kind of a community in that area. It's pretty much gone now, but they had the housing at that point started. And they got about 20 units of housing down there, and they used HUD money to get it going. Had a little board, and that model was, he did it again in the Blackshear neighborhood, he did it again in the Guadalupe neighborhood. And John just was starting these nonprofits everywhere, and it was great because it created low-income housing. And we saw that model. A lawyer we went to at Legal Aid, his name was Jim Piper, and he said, have you thought about starting a nonprofit and getting a real estate business? And I said, no. But he sent me down to the Guadalupe neighborhood, and John Henneberger was working in their house. It's funny going down there because I couldn't see him. His feet were sticking out from under. He's working underneath it on something on the underpinning. And I didn't know where he was. He didn't know who I was. And I yelled, are you John Henneberger? And he says, what's it to you? And finally he crawled out of there, and we talked a little while, and he agreed. He's a masochist. He agreed to help us start a nonprofit, and we had legal aid help, and we did. That put us, it was an interesting thing because the university had not done any liaison with Austin City Council. They just went over there and started annexing. So we found we had some friends down at City Council, particularly Sally Shipman. And there were some down there that would help us out. We went down, and our neighborhood association president, Catherine Poole, and Alice Lenoir, her neighbor, they asked for $1 million in funding. They weren't shy about asking for money.
All right.
And when the city looked at it, and they were a bit angry with the university for encroaching into that area without permission or coordinating it, so they gave us $500,000. in Community Block Development Grants, CDBG funds, and they're federal funds. And we took those, and we were going to build, the contract called for 10 houses. We eventually built 11. But what we did, we went in and we found lots and spread them around. We purchased them here, there, and everywhere. And that, when suddenly you had another developer, particularly a neighborhood developer in the area, that really made the university folks upset. The administration was not happy at all with that because they had an active developer in the area. And that became our defense, really. We had the press going for us, but to get anything out of that, we had to get some real estate to keep ourselves there. And we won the battle. The university went down. They dealt with mayors for a long time, tried to get them to not let us have the funds. They tried to block it one way or another, and they couldn't do it. Federal money, we hadn't done anything. We were just doing what a normal neighborhood does to develop. So we got about 5 lots, and we couldn't find the other one. We leased some land from the city for 50 years and put 6 units of elderly housing on that. But we spread those around, and that kind of despoils the annexation process, because what do you do when somebody has federal money on land? It's a messy thing to try to condemn
Federal
land that has federal money on it.
Mm-hmm.
It gets a little tough because the Attorney General, the Justice Department, has to defend the neighborhood if they request it. That changed the complexion of the situation considerably. But university continued to buy, and in an area from Leona Street back over to Campbell, they had more than half those properties. And by 1990, that area was pretty much purchased by the university. In 1988, they did one event to really, try to discourage us. They had a blitzkrieg over there, and they bulldozed 25 houses one weekend without notice. One of the veterans of that fiasco is here tonight, and what occurred, though, we had befriended a group of people of the Street People's Advisory Committee, SPAC, and this is a loose-knit group of homeless men who saw our cause. Here they are homeless, and the university's over bulldozing houses. What's wrong with that picture? Mm-hmm. So these fellows came over, and one of them sat on a roof. In fact, they all got on roofs there for a day. There were 3 or 4 of them on roofs, and they couldn't bulldoze those houses. And it was a great passive resistance. Now, nobody from the neighborhood got out and did that. I was working in a day job at that point. I think I would have crawled out and did it. But so many of my black neighbors would not get involved because they said if we get arrested and they take us to jail, they'll throw away the key. Yeah. They were afraid of being incarcerated, and you can't blame them. And so, doing anything as forthright as protesting and actually impeding the bulldozing, no, my neighbors weren't going to do it. We did appreciate that very much, though, and there was a wrongful arrest involved, and there was an award, I believe, of $70,000, and couldn't go to the homeless guys, but the lawyers who got it, we shamed them into giving us $30,000 that we put into another housing development, which was kind of nice. But James Williams, who was the president of SPAC, he worked with us for a number of years, and they're the ones that also got down on the lake, and they did these really nice protests. They built a condo down on the lake, and these guys were homeless, so they took out and they played boat people. They were Vietnamese boat people for a while. And they had Homer the Goose, and they had him out there, and all kinds of people. A number of folks who are still around town that were involved in that. Lori Renteria over from East Cesar Chavez neighborhood area. And it was a kind of a nice period of protest there in the late 80s with a lot of creative things going on around housing. And when one group would protest like that, it kind of fueled all the, if you will, a consciousness about needing more affordable housing, which goes on now. We still don't have enough. But the university kind of heightened that because they're here, they're bulldozing and stuff. They didn't need those units, however, and that made it very difficult for them to do any kind of justification. It became a moral issue, and it was cast that way. Why can one entity do this with all these poor folks here? And we were working along on that. We could see, though, we were going to lose eventually. But bless her heart, the treasurer at that time, state of Texas, Ann Richards, wrote us a letter in 1988 and said, "Is there any way I can help you?" Yes, you can. If you would, we would like to get Big Brother off our back here and keep our neighborhood. And so, any way you could influence the university to stop their annexation, we would appreciate it very much. Well, lo and behold, she was elected, and when she became governor, she wrote a letter. Well, she appointed a new regent over the UT system, Jack Blanton. And she wrote Jack a letter, and she said, "I would appreciate it if you would come to peace with the neighborhood, the Blackland neighborhood, and find a way to come into some kind of peaceful coexistence." And we took that opportunity, and we offered what we call a 50-50 proposition. Since they had the majority of land up to Leona Street, we said, okay, you won't encroach any more from Leona, and our nonprofit won't buy anything on that side of Leona, and that'll become our Maginot line. That'll be our permanent line right there. We're not going to, you don't come on our side, and we'll divest our property on that side, and you'll divest to you, and you divest yours to us. They had a whole lot more property on our side than we did on theirs. We got 16 houses and lots, and then 8 vacant lots from the ones they had bulldozed in that exchange. So I already built 11 houses, so we'd get 16. Suddenly we're at 27 houses and 8 vacant lots to build on. So we're rolling, Suddenly we got critical mass. And, we got enough to buy, hire a property manager even, take care of this. And it was kind of an exciting time because our little board suddenly had something to manage. The treaty we cut with Bill Cunningham, the president of UT in 1992, called for, quote, peaceful coexistence, just right out of UN jargon. But it also called for both entities to stop the encroachment and that line be settled in there. Now, what was tough was in the area between Leona Street and Comal became a DMZ because there were a number of residents out in there and businesses on the fringe on Manor Road and south on MLK and a church. And those people, we cut, to deal with that, we said you will never use eminent domain on these folks and you will not badger them to sell. So they could live there as long as they wanted to in a sea of parking. Every time there's a football game or anything, those folks are out in the middle of it. And there are still 17 residents and 2 businesses there in that area. And we're very pleased. We met with President Powers last week. And I hadn't been up there since 1992, a 20-year anniversary for me from going in and signing a peace treaty with Bill Cunningham. But reminded him, we talked about that treaty, and one of the things we really appreciated, the residents did, is they had honored the clause where they would not use condemnation on those residents. So Miss Medlock, Miss Swisher, a number of residents were able to live out their lives there, and their kids took the property and are living there too now. So those African-American homes continue to be African-American homes. But they're in the middle of the DMZ out there, and they just have to accept all the parking. But we keep an eye out for them. In any negotiations, we remind the university that those folks are there and we care about them and hope they will too. So that has worked out. And that's where all those houses were, that most of them that were bulldozed. And some of those houses, one of the houses that they sat on is still over there. We were able to get a family to buy it. We couldn't buy it. And our agreement is not to buy in that area, but there are a number of rental properties in that zone. Now, that's kind of where we were up to 1992. We had that agreement. We could see at that point that the next thing would happen if we stabilized the land in the area and got the university away from us. The next thing that would happen was it would gentrify. Upscale people, more affluent people would start to come in because it was an investment property. There were a lot of properties over there that would become for sale. So we could see that would become the next battle. What I'd like to do, though, is stop right now, and this is a 2-part presentation. I want to do the first part, the 1992, the battle with the university, and then talk with you, because I don't like to talk. I'd rather take your questions and discuss things. And then we'll talk about the next 18 years up to now to where we dealt with gentrification and are trying to deal with it, which is an ongoing battle. So up to that point, 1992, we started out our battle in 1980 to 92, which is the first battle of Blackland.
What's the status on the mixed-use development on the corner of Leona and MLK? And then the person who owns that DMZ block, is he friendly to the cause? Does he?
He is. Mr. Gooden owns that southwest block down in that area, and he has a lot more properties than you can see when you travel down MLK.
Oh, yeah.
And he's Mr. Gooden's a super guy. He's in his later 80s now, still very lucid, sharp guy. He was fighting with us throughout the whole thing. And you know, when we cut the deal and dropped him in the DMZ, and the DMZ is not just one block there. It goes down Manor Road and includes my house. It's a slice that goes all the way down there. And my neighbor is University Interscholastic League building. It's 4 stories high, and it covers that end of the block, and then I've got my little house on the corner there. But I'm in a DMZ as well. But Mr. Gooden had a lot of properties down in there, and he was very friendly with us and is a good colleague. I talked to him 2 weeks ago. He's in good health. We just check in every now and then, and I tell him what I know is going on. And I've got to call him again and tell him about the meeting with Powers and let him know that that went well, and they're still aware that, you know, that area is not to be used for condemnation if they can help it. And Powers pretty much, he knew that, and he wasn't interested in going back to refight the battle. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, there was also the mixed-use development they were trying to put in on the corner of Leona and MLK.
South of Leona,
Yeah,
in that area.
Yeah.
That's an interesting battle there, because a man had acquired about a half block of land there, and he wanted to rezone that and make it into condos. And you get into a strategy we've got over there. We know if they bring in condos that the price of the real estate will go way up. And that will permeate across the neighborhood, and so all those people who are paying taxes and maintaining their place right here are going to go under. And that's how it happens. And the condos are the most expensive property that comes in. Now, they were willing for their half block to pay almost $600,000 for just the land on that block, which made each lot 2 to 2.5 times more than the other land in the area. Now, when the tax appraisers come in, they look at those lots and say, that lot's worth a couple $100,000, where your lot that used to be $60,000 is worth $200,000 now. Again, that's a property tax state. That's the way it works. You can protest your appraisal, but you're not going to get much out of it. So that one we fought them, though. Some of my upscale neighbors wanted the condos to come in because they want the price of the land to go up because they're going to make more out of it. If you're affluent, you don't mind paying the taxes. Right? Oh, price of land's more. Great. But if you're up to here and you can't afford the taxes, it's bad news. We looked it over, and how many of our marginal homeowners and landlords would be impacted by that, and they would have given us in their, I believe it was about 60 units they were going to build there in a 2-story complex. They would have given us up to 15 affordable units. But we looked out across the neighborhood and we saw we were going to lose about 30 units of affordable housing and get taxed out over about a 5-year period. We didn't like the math, and so we fought them and we won. We got the super majority is used to the council if you get a petition, a valid petition, signed by about 30% or more of the owners around it. And Mr. Gooden, the gentleman that you mentioned, the major owner, he could have almost done it by himself, but he combined with several of the rest of us. Our nonprofit had 2 lots in that area, and we had enough to force a critical vote. And from the council, they had to have a supermajority, which meant 6 out of the 7 of them had to vote for the zoning change. They couldn't get it together, and they gave up. Now, when the owner had this half block, when he couldn't sell to the condo people, he sold the university. Now, ironically, we'd rather have the university develop it than the condo people, because it's state land. And the state land tax, it's not taxed, so the tax base doesn't change. So that works for us. We've had 2 other situations where people wanted to build condos in the periphery or in areas that are multifamily, and we were able to work them out and fight those down. So far, we haven't had any condos in Blackland, but it's a big battle every time it happens, because some of my neighbors want it and some of them don't. And you know, our fighting never ends. But on keeping out the big condos, what our nonprofit has tried to do, and I was raised in Oklahoma on a farm, we call this the poison watermelon policy. What you do is somebody's stealing your watermelons, you don't need to poison the whole patch, you just poison one and put up a sign, one of these watermelons is poison. In the real estate area, what you do is you get a house on every block. And if the condo people can't get a block or a half block, they don't want it. They can't make the math work to put in their monstrosities. So you can keep out the condos if you get you spread your real estate around. But what occurs though, you cannot keep out individual entrepreneurs who may buy a lot and put in a McMansion and do that. We can't stop those. We've slowed them down, and recently we've had a change. When the housing boom stopped, a number of this is an interesting thing. In 2006, we had a lot of the McMansion people come in. They bought cheap lots and built their dream homes on them. And they were in there and they began to flip them. And they would sell these things every year or two. And our transient population back in the mid part of 2004 to 2008 were the upscalers. They'd be there about a year, 6 months, and they'd sell their house again and again and again. Usually to .com buyers who didn't know anything about the neighborhood. And instead of renters being the transient, it was the affluent people who were building their upscale housing. And that was an interesting thing, because some of them would be gone before we almost knew them. And the ones who were there, again, they usually had iron fences around their houses, not all, but most of them. And, you know, the fence would open up, the gate would open up in the morning, and they'd drive out, fence closed. They went wherever they worked. Come back in the evening, and the fence opens up, they go back in there, and they on the other side of the fence. That was our neighbors. Now, when you have that, an interesting thing occurs, you have an increase in crime. When you have whole social voids in a neighborhood, it invites crime. These people are not there during the day, nobody watches your house, and when they're there at night, they're not watching either. And so they might as well be on ships of sea, because they're not part of the community, they're just there. And that causes a neighborhood to kind of go down in a way. Recently, though, we've had an interesting thing occur. The new buyers have looked at the market, and most of them have gone in and they talk to somebody now, and they'll find out what the neighborhood's about, and they find out, oh, it's going to be a kind of a mixed income neighborhood, because the nonprofit has 47 units now. We have about 25% of the single family units in the neighborhood. We have critical mass. And as long as the nonprofit operates, there's going to be a mixed income group there and lower income people. We don't rent to anyone who makes more than 60% of the average for Austin. And our average is 32%, right in with public housing. So people who don't want to live around those people, renters, don't want to buy in the neighborhood. But people who want to live in a mixed income and an integrated neighborhood do want to move in. And we're getting new families now that want to live there because it is integrated. And our motto has been from, you know, we were fighting UT, we had to get a positive motto. So we borrowed from Martin Luther King, Dream, and our motto is the dream starts here. We do want a diverse neighborhood, and it's okay to have some upscale folks. Some of our upscale neighbors are super people. They come out and volunteer, they're nice folks. It's because you happen to get some money, I don't know, maybe you're lucky or maybe you're smart, it doesn't make you evil. And that can work out. We do have some of them, however, who don't want the renting people there, and that's a different animal. That's a different kind of affluent person. That kind of prejudice I personally have a problem with, but fortunately those people are, at this point, are a minority in our neighborhood. I don't know if that'll continue through time. I have no way of knowing that, but I do know that our nonprofit housing contributes to that diversity. A lot of it's there, and that's how we try to maintain it. But we've got a strategy, a land development strategy, and a strategic plan. For Slouches, our little 9-person board even has a strategic plan, and we can spell strategic on a good day. Yes?
What's the income threshold that you said 60% of Austin income, so what does that mean?
For a single person, you could make more than $18,000 and get in one of our units. You know, and it changed. It's a moving target because the average income changes for Central Texas. But you know, I think family with 2 kids, 43,000, I believe. You couldn't make any more than that. The city had policies for a while that they wanted to rent to people who made up to 80%, which is a normal apartment rental market. But we were trying to hit people who couldn't make that, lower income people, because 80% would gentrify our neighborhood, especially if you go back to what the prices were when UT was creating the blight. You were renting a unit over there for $100 a month back in the late 70s. Those days are gone, but now, you know, our unit's a 2-bedroom unit. We'll rent. We do the HUD rule where you don't pay more than 30% of your income in any month, but we have a base on it, and they're not going to pay any more than $450 on average for that. What we're really about, while I dwell on housing, we're really about families, and within the families, we're really about the kids. Because you find that in low-income families, if they get a break on their rent, let's say they're making less than, they're saving $200 or $300 a month on rent, that goes straight to their kids. That's shoes and classes and cultural things, maybe a dance class or a class they go to after school or something that otherwise they would not get. So the long-term investment in this low-income housing is not the adults. It's really not about the housing at all, but it's about the kids. In 1988, after UT had bulldozed so many houses in that area, there were no young families. I had the only 2 kids in a 4-block area, my daughters. They were pretty lonely. Now, the area at Salina and 22nd Street, we rebuilt all those vacant lots, and there are 26 kids within that area there. I mean, it's teeming with kids, and it's music to my ear to hear kids playing in the evening and afternoon, you know, when they come home from school. For years and years, it was just silent down there. There was nothing but elderly and a couple of holdouts, you know, like me, but the neighborhood was pretty much decimated. The new folks coming in, though, they're struggling families, and we have a policy: we do not sell any houses. There's a myth about home ownership in America, and during the housing boom, you know, a lot of low-income people bought into that. They paid very high for houses, and they got variable interest rates, and they got screwed. You're seeing maybe this week some of the justice on that, where Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and the big guys who had abused so many families are finally doing restitution, and they're kicking back $26 billion to try to do something for that. It's not going to really handle it, but the big change is that they will no longer inflate the price of the housing, and they will let them read the contracts in front of one salesperson instead of, they have robo-signing where you just sit there and sign a stack of documents that thick. You had no idea what you're signing. And you'd be doing that in front of 3 or 4 of the bankers, lenders, and people can't know what they're doing, and they got screwed, a lot of them in that. We had lost a couple of families that bought into those sweet deals in 2006, and they couldn't afford to rent. I mean, the mortgage. And the issue on it, the banks would lend them the money based on their gross income, not their net. And so they get in the house, and they're going under by $200 or $300 a month. They can't make it. And one of them takes a job, or they don't, or they borrow, or they do whatever they got to do. And there's so many of those people went under, those kind of families. So it's a real struggle. But we don't sell houses. We rent them only because rental property is a non-renewable resource in our neighborhood. We made a mistake and sold 3 units years ago, and that didn't work out, because eventually those families are going to sell too. And guess who they're going to sell to? Not going to be poor people. When you sell your units in a neighborhood, you just delay the gentrification. You don't stop it. So our rental stuff, again, it's the poison watermelons out here, but they're not poison. I mean, they're great stuff. I really enjoy my neighbors. You know, our little board, 9 people on it, and we always have at least 3 of the tenants are on the board. They have a conflict of interest if they try to lower their rent, but they can vote on everything else, and especially our policies, and make sure it's fair. And I love having them on the board. They're our most active board members. And we got our vice president now is one of the tenants. Bernice is great. More questions?
I've got 2 questions. The first question is, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the changing role of federal housing policy that allowed for the Blackland Development Corporation to emerge, that was slightly different or very different than the policy of housing under urban renewal that was initially going to be the wave that would have been leading to its bulldozing. That change that allowed for that shift. And the other thing I was wondering if you could comment on is the changing nature of the student population at the University of Texas, which was in 1960 exclusively an all-white campus, and whether or not the entrance of more minority students at the University of Texas influenced the success of the community to address the concerns by about the university's expansion.
Let me take your question. Of course, I don't want to integrate the answers because they're very different questions, but I appreciate them both. Let me tell the two neighborhoods to contrast the urban renewal versus the federal policies like with community block development grants. The Blackshear neighborhood was going to be developed by urban renewal, which people in East Austin call urban removal. Mm-hmm. What they did, the federal government would go in an area and say, this is blighted, and we're going to buy up all these houses, and we're going to change this around, and we're going to put in better housing. And when they did that, of course, the people who had been there before couldn't afford the better housing. And that was urban renewal. And the urban removal thing came because the traditional residents were just pushed out with federal money. And that was the thrust of it. The Blackshear neighborhood was going to be renewed, and the neighborhood organized and fought that for years and years. They were fighting that before we got involved, but they were able to get eventually stop that, and a new policy came in where the federal government would allow cities to take block development grants and give them to local nonprofits to build housing for their tenants or the residents in their area. Blackshear was able to make the transition and resist the urban renewal thing long enough to get the CDBG funds to begin to develop their own housing their own way and keep their residents. And it's a perfect model to demonstrate that transition because they were the one community that got involved in both areas. They suffered under urban removal, but they were able to revive that and keep some of their housing under urban renewal. Under the CDBG funds. What occurred is that particular nonprofit sold some of their houses, however, and they did not keep a lot of them in rental. And so today, I'm not sure, but I think they have around 20 properties in rental, and they're all kind of clustered. So that area that did not really keep away the gentrification like another strategy would. And you know, we didn't invent a lot of stuff. We just looked around and got some best practices and borrowed things in our little nonprofit. But we could see that our spreading our bets and our housing would deal with the gentrification. But back to urban renewal, there was a point in there where really the federal government was encouraging displacement and gentrification and the destruction of cultures. And then it shifted over to where they actually began to give seed money into those communities if they could organize. And that if they can organize is a big if, because not all neighborhoods have the capacity to put together a nonprofit. And we were lucky, and our nonprofits made enough errors, I can tell you everything not to do. I mean, we're in our 29th year. We've made plenty of mistakes. And keeping a nonprofit board going, there's really 3 battles in Blackland. And a nonprofit board, just keeping that going and keeping out of trouble. There's conflicts of interest. You get board members that may want to rent houses to their relatives or friends. You can't go there, you know. And there's a lot of pitfalls, a lot of ways you can screw up a nonprofit. So you got to be very careful. We were fortunate early on to have some legal advice from legal aid. We still get that from time to time. And there's a group called Texas CBAR that will help any neighborhood incorporate, and they will find pro bono lawyers to help you do that. Second part of your question, student population. Is that okay on the urban renewal versus the shift in there? The history of the Blackshear neighborhood, you would find the answers to that very well if anyone wanted to research that, because it's a perfect transition from one policy to another. But on the student population at UT, yes, you go back to the 60s, and it was known as a white man's university, period, end. And the real change that we witnessed over there culturally is 1968, when they integrated the athletic department. And up to that point, it was all white. They would occasionally have when they do the Texas relays, they would bring people from all over the United States, and they had to deal with black athletes from other universities. So that was how some black athletes actually got on the UT campus before 1968. After 1968, it opened up and they began to recruit, and it changed dramatically. But to that point, the student body was predominantly white. It has moved along, and I see it a lot because we get numbers of volunteers from the university to come over and help us with our nonprofit housing. A lot of our stuff we can't get federal money for, and so we just go in and we get materials maybe from Home Depot or donated, and we get students that volunteer. We have an average of about 4,800 volunteer hours a year. And we just finished a duplex last year, and we had 9,000 hours of labor on it. Most of it was from UT kids. Now, within that, there were a lot of student groups and just students who showed up from classes, and it was great. I love the multicultural university we've evolved to be, because there were Muslims, there were Jewish groups that came in. We had, oddly enough, a small group of Native Americans that came in, mostly Cherokees. We had all kinds of people coming in. Very diverse, international groups. We had Asians, amazing menagerie. And when you're cooking for volunteers, you know, you want to fix something for everyone, including the vegetarians and so forth. And that's a nightmare when you have 20 people out there and you have 4 or 5 diets. But we found kind of a rule: have at least, if you got 20 people, have about 4 or 5 vegetarian meals there for them, and then don't cook any pork. You can settle most of it, you just don't cook pork. I was raised in southern Oklahoma, and our big meal there was smothered chicken. And we had fried chicken 6 days a week, and on Sunday we smothered the chicken. And all smothered chicken is fried chicken. You put it in a pot and you put it up to its nose in milk, real rich milk if you got it, a lot of pepper, and just let it simmer for a few hours, and it turns into something very different. It's not chicken and gravy. You got to try it sometime. You got leftover chicken, and it works with southern fried tofu. If you've been to Wheatsville and you've ever had any of their fried tofu, I built that, and my Muslims just went nuts. And I had one great big fellow that came in and he just loved it. He said, "Tell me that wasn't chicken." I said, "It was tofu." He said, "Ah." It's fun to cook for that many people and try to appease their taste, and it's also fun just to have communal meals like that when you're working. And a lot of folks really don't have a lot of skills, which you don't have to have. If you got a good attitude, that'll go a long way. And we have folks that learn very quickly, and we've got enough people to make team leaders, and the senior team leaders, we're not very good. But we all know some skills the others. We got a good tile man, can lay down tile, and we got a guy that's a pretty good carpenter and a good roof guy. And what we don't have is some of us old fogies, and I turned 66 week before last. Our legs are getting a little out of kilter, and the gravity's getting kind of high. So it's great to get, I call you young folks ladder monkeys. You're going to scoot up those things, and I can't do that anymore. But we can kind of supervise, and we've had only one accident in the last 6 years. And I stepped through a ceiling, and it was me. I broke a rib and cracked a leg. We had a house, an older house, and it had been, it was one of the houses that moved on that UT donated to us. And the ceilings in 3/4 of the house had shiplap, and you could walk across the ceilings. But they had an add-on that was just sheetrock. And I walked out on that, and the ice didn't hold. And of course, there's 2x4 joists up there, and I hit them. And it would have been fun to have a video camera underneath just my legs in the ceiling up there, but it's not fun. But we get scraps and scratches and stuff like that. But by and large, people just, you can pull a common sense and work pretty good. What's interesting, we have some of the kids in the neighborhood to come out and work. And we have a lot of our typical family will be a single parent, female head of household, a couple of kids. And she frequently is working a job and a half and some of them are very skilled. And some of them run a skill saw a lot better than I can and know a lot more about carpentering than I do. I'm not going to say, it's not a sexist thing. They don't have time to work with their kids, but they send them over and the kids will work in our projects. And we'll put them in the teams. And they learn to use cordless drills, and we try not to teach them to cuss, but every now and then that comes up. Well, we will hit our thumbs. We do have some small accidents. But it's fun to bring the kids out there and work with them. And they do things like build bird houses and bat houses. We love to get bat houses in there. We have a mosquito problem over there. But we have some little things we do with them. And then they work on the regular projects. Every time we're priming, who can screw up the primer on a house? So we get them in there and they can slap primer on the walls. And if they get more on the walls than they do themselves, they're doing pretty good, But we've had some of them that would start out in the Martinez twins started. They were about 10 years old, and then they got older and older and older, and their voices changed, and they don't come around anymore. They got other things more important to do. But for a while we had them, and it's fun to watch them grow up in there and work with us. So in those houses, we built tree houses for them right quick. We get our density over there by adding tree houses. A lot of density like that works very well. It's some of the people in the neighborhood work on it, but we get more volunteers from outside. But I'm really stimulated with the international volunteers, and they seem to have this sense, and many of them a desire for communal work and working in groups like this. It's much stronger. It's hard to say. I'm a social anthropologist, so you have to really go into this and do a lot of study. But many of us were, raised on TV and in front of a computer, and working with our hands is alien to us. What I find, though, is a lot of people who were in that stack, when they get an opportunity to work with their hands, they really do well. They learn fast, and seem to get a lot more enjoyment. All of a sudden, you actually can see something you did. It's not just digits that go somewhere. It's not emails. It's not Twitter. It's not any of that. It's not just information. It's actually something physical. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of therapeutic for a lot of folks. I had one big fella came over, East Indian, and he dug a hole for the first time in his life. He was just laughing up a storm digging this hole. It was for a concrete pillar for one of our houses, and he dug this beautiful square hole. Took him most of the day, but he was just laughing. And his deal was he was working on his doctorate in computer, some branch of the computer sciences, but he'd never actually worked like that. And it's a joy for him to get out there and do it. He was just in nirvana, just digging a hole. It was wonderful to work with him. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. I think the story you've told us it's clear that there's a kind of geographic racism going on with eminent domain and this primarily white, at that time, totally white institution going over and seizing land from a black community and sort of breaking up the community. Can you talk a little bit more explicitly about the ways that race and racism played in this battle with UT administrators and things that came up with your dealings with them about race?
Sure. The UT administrators, sometimes I say UT, and when I say that, I mean the UT administration, because we had the students and the faculty passed as faculty senate. They passed resolutions supporting the neighborhood several times during that 12-year fight. And the university administration, though, are not stupid people. We're intelligent. And in fact, one of them, who was over the land development office, was a really nice fellow. You find out, you get in battles at times, and some people on the other side are really nice, And so they did not, I never heard them say anything racist, make any comments that were racist comments, the UT administrators we worked with. And they were fairly careful with their words, because they were aware that whatever they said would possibly be broadcast or repeated. And they were carrying policy, and particularly this one person who was the head of their land development office. And he would bring us the bad news, and he would tell us that, and he was a good communicator. But at no time did I hear Jim ever say anything racist. He was a hard man not to like. And the same was true with Ed Sharp, who was a UT Vice President for Community Affairs, and he was at one point, I believe, the head of United Way. And he's a nice guy too, but nice people get on a side of an issue, it's very awkward. And Ed told us at one point, he said, yeah, your neighborhood's been abused. And he had sessions with us, we brought in the community, and they took a beating sometimes. But I never heard them say anything racist, to their credit. And I know with Jim, who was white, it was not a race issue with him, and he was truly sorry for what was going on. But he was like an emissary bringing bad news sometimes. Rarely was it good. But underneath it all, you know, it goes all the way back to 1928. And you may not invent a racist plan, but as late as 1992, the UT administrators were circulating memos justifying their annexation based on the racist 1928 plan. So you don't have to invent the racism, you just have to continue with it. And that's where they went with it. Does that answer your question?
I believe it was a little over a year ago. It's in the local press that Representative Eddie Rodriguez was working on some kind of, I never knew whether it was local laws or state legislation to work out a way for homeowners in East Austin to get a break on their property taxes. And then I even emailed to find out what the, you know, what their approach was going to be, and I never heard back from them or anything. Did you ever hear of that, and what happened, and what was he really trying to do?
Well, I do know about it, and I'll promise not to tell you more than I know, but I wish I knew more about it. But it's a way of giving some relief to low-income homeowners.
Was it a state thing?
It was a state. It was state legislation, and many states have what they call a circuit breaker law. And if you're at 80% income, median income, and your taxes go up to a certain level in some states, they freeze the taxes. And that's called a circuit breaker. You hit that point and they freeze the taxes. Now it's hard to administer, and particularly in Texas, because you would have to be able to certify that I'm at 80% MFI and that the taxes are there, and you almost create another agency to implement the circuit breaker law. So it has quite a cost that comes with the legislation. And in Texas, with the budget crunches we've had in recent decades, it's a good excuse not to do anything if there's a high price tag for implementing a program. So that did not pass. That did not pass.
The bill actually came up for a vote, huh?
It came up, never got out of committee.
Oh, it never got
Those never get out of committee. Eddie Rodriguez is a saint. He's good about taking things that he knows not going to go anywhere, but he tries anyway, and it just irritates the devil out of the liberals, you know. And it works. But sometimes he gets something through, and he did sneak one through in the last session that you might be interested in, but it's for a community-wide thing. And they created community land trusts in any city of I believe 50,000 or more in Texas, if they so choose, can designate neighborhoods and communities to take on a land trust. Now, what's a land trust? Like in our case, the Blackland CDC, we have 47 properties, but a lot of them are multifamily and duplexes. So we only have about 30 vacant lots if you pulled all the houses off. And that's what the land trust would go into it. When you get that land trust in, then you're subject to having no taxes on it. Now, if you were a private homeowner in my area, and you want, and Blackland CDC starts a land trust, and you were under 80% MFI, and you wanted to put it in our land trust, you could put your land in there, and we would give you a 99-year lease back on your land, and you'd be relieved of those taxes. And for our folks who are up to taxes, you know, right here, about to go under, that will keep some of them going for another generation or two, or maybe 99 years. And that lease would go ride with your heirs. If you wanted to leave it with your children, that lease would ride right on through. And other states have tried that, and it works fairly well. East Coast, which run in this, and West Coast run into gentrification issues a lot faster than we did because of the density of the population and the land real estate processes. But we're catching on to it here. But they snuck that through the legislature in the last session. Wow. And now the city of Austin, the city council, as we speak, is deliberating on actually implementing that and designating several nonprofits, one being ours, to set up land trusts. And if we can lock all of our 30 lots into 99-year leases, that's going to be kind of nice for me, because I've worked with this dadgum nonprofit 29 years. And, you know, I don't know who's going to inherit it after I'm dead and gone, but I'm hoping they would have the same philosophy and do the dream starts here and want to have a diverse neighborhood and all that. I may not be there, but I'd love to lock it in where they don't have very many options. whoever they may be, and it could be that the ones that follow me are much better, and ones that do that do our goals better than
Clause
not.
in there for renegotiation after 99 years, or
I don't know. I would hope they would, but you know, I'll take the 99 years right now. And you get into legal beagle issues. You know, they don't do anything into perpetuity. They do 99-year leases, 99 years. Some reason or another, the legal folks don't like to go into perpetuity. They don't do that, but they do 99 years, and we like that. We'll live with 99 years for 99 years. Mary, much more.
The state, Human Services, has developed a center for the elimination of disparities and disproportionality.
That's a
This-
lot to spell.
It is a lot to spell, the CEDD. So the purpose in this case is for the state agency, human service agencies, to reflect back to themselves where in their policies and procedures have they created and are maintaining disparities and thus disproportionality, which I think is awesome. So I'm just curious, considering that that is a relatively new context but is playing forward, how might that be played out against something like the 1928 disparity and subsequent disproportionality that continues to plague our community and can plague its relationships?
And the disparity, you know, they could do that without a special agency. The disproportionality, though, disproportionate impact on a particular racial group is what I assume we're alluding to. That one's a tough one to prove because you've got to know who your clients are. You've got to have a profile, you know who's coming through your doors and then what happened to them. And from what I can see, like I'm going to pick on social workers, but their caseloads are so high and their paperwork they do is so thick. It would take a major revamping, I think, of just the forms they have to begin to get the data to make a database for proving or disproving disproportionality. That would have to come from a top all the way down to the little caseworker that's filling out ethnicity or race, and it's difficult, and in some cases they can't ask that question, so I'm not sure how they're going to track it.
I know that
You got a chicken or the egg there.
I know that they have looked at discipline in schools and found great disparity and disproportionality in discipline. So that which is on the book that's most egregious, which is like having a gun and that kind of level, has never been committed by a person of color. But the discretionary dismissal from the classroom is where the disproportionality goes out the window, and those youth are referred to the justice system. So I know I'm diverging at one level from obviously community housing, but I think it all ends up kind of being woven together in some way.
Housing is just one of the elements, and it's a major element.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get beyond housing, the next thing you get into, of course, is energy use.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into quality of education real quick, and that's always there. And if you think the discrimination is not there in education, I have bad news for you. We have very segregated schools in Austin, very segregated. L.L. Campbell, which is our little elementary school nearby, used to be almost 100% black. Now it's about 50-50 Latino black. Last year in the elementary class, the first grade, they had 2 Anglos, and the rest were all black and brown. And that's going on, and they tried, the AISD to their credit, wanted to expand that district and pull it over a segment of the Cherrywood neighborhood that was predominantly white, and pull in about 30 kids from that area and integrate the first 2 grades. And it's a great idea. On a personal level, imagine that you're going to send your child, and let's make the child white, to a majority black, brown class, and they're going to be the only one in the class probably that's white. And kids can be merciless on the playground. It's the same situation if you reverse it and your black child was going to an all white. I mean, it's the same difficulty. Imagine you're a parent making that decision. How do you integrate school becomes the real issue here. If I can kind of go into that area, a real case on the ground, you want critical mass. You would want 5 or 6 kids of different ethnicity than the majority to come in at one time. And there's enough of them to create critical mass in social terms. And that might work. And so the experiment to pull out some of the white kids from the Cherrywood neighborhood and pull them into those classes would have been fine, but guess who balked? They found elegant ways in the Cherrywood neighborhood to put that off. Later. We'll do that later. And that's always been the excuse for continued racism. Let's wait. It's not time to do that yet.
Right.
But you get into the disparities and disproportionality, the public schools is a place to find it. In Austin, we've got a wonderful intellectual veneer with our university here and our high-tech stuff, but underneath it, we've got a history of racism that rolls back well beyond 1928, but it was institutionalized then.
Yeah.
And we're still suffering from it. It's still there. Wish you had baited me with that question earlier. I might have studied up on it, Martha. It's a great question.
There's an opportunity.
Other questions? I'd rather discuss them.
While you're talking about Cherrywood, I'm just curious. It's such a bold contrast. The neighbor in the Blacklands neighborhood in Cherrywood. Can you talk about the history of Cherrywood and how they have existed side by side?
They were north of Manor Road, so they were not affected by the 1928 plan. And they were able to continue on, and that neighborhood's been there. It's a historic neighborhood, wonderful neighborhood. I got a lot of friends up there. And they have some black people in that area, but not many, and they're fewer and fewer. And they are being taxed out and moving out and so forth. They no longer have what you call critical mass in terms of a culture. But if you go down Cherrywood, the street there, for about 3 blocks on the west side, you'll find still numerous black families in there. I won't say numerous, there's 7 or 8. But they feel like the Lone Rangers, and they do not go to the neighborhood association meetings. You know, when something comes up, they always feel left out, but they're isolated. Mm-hmm. The neighborhood itself, very liberal folks, very nice. A number of them come down and volunteered with us. A lot of friends up there, they're good folks. There's real estate up there. You know, to get a house in a neighborhood, you're going to pay $250,000. Mm-hmm. So it prices out low-income people, and hence it prices out people of color, who are disproportionately represented in the low-income groups in Austin and in Texas in general. But the folks up there, you talk to them, and just like my folks in my neighborhood, they're nice people. They're not evil, but what... And I've talked to some of them who are really upset with the property tax situation in Texas. And they feel real frustrated coming into a neighborhood, and they wanted to build a nice home and live there, and who can blame them for that? Yet inadvertently, what occurs around them, because Texas is a property tax state, they screw some of the low-income neighborhoods, which was not their intent. And some of them very heartfelt conversations of what can we do? How do we get around this? Change the state law, and that's not going to happen soon in Texas. When I talked to Eddie Rodriguez and some of the other legislators, Elliot Naistott particularly, no, it's just not going to happen in Texas. That's an institutional thing, and it affects all the way down into neighborhoods, and good people end up being evil inadvertently, very innocently, because of property taxes. And Cherrywood people are, I think, classic in that respect. They really empathize and help us in Blackland. And they voted with us when we needed stuff. They've been very supportive. But they're not going to integrate. There is a way to do it. People like my age, some of us didn't have kids, I did, but some of them don't have anybody to inherit their property. If you had a nonprofit, say in Cherrywood, and us old Asian baby boomers begin to go away, if that nonprofit, if we donated our land and our houses to the nonprofit with a restrictive covenant that rides with it, and that was going to be a situation where that land, our house, would be used for low-income people defined at either whatever you want, 60% MFI, let's say, into perpetuity. That would ride with the land, and a neighborhood over time, let's say you get 3 or 4 people in 1 year who pass on and donate it to the nonprofit, and the nonprofit manages it. And you could contract even with us for the Cherrywood area, and we did it for a while, until they got critical mass, maybe 20 units, and they get their own property manager, I'm sure. and run it themselves. But if you had a little nonprofit board that was dedicated to integrating a neighborhood over a long period of time, you could do it that way and never have any investment at all, no federal money or anything like that, just donations of property deeded to you from people who really want to integrate the world, and that becomes their legacy. That can happen. You don't have to anything. What you got to have, those two things. You got to have the desire to do it. If you don't have that, it ain't going to happen. And the other part of it, you got to have people who are going to stick around a while. People move a lot. You take a nonprofit, you can't take for granted. We started a nonprofit 29 years ago, and we've been through all kinds of stuff. How many people live in an area for 29 years? I've been there 33 years. Nobody lives anywhere for 33 years anymore except Martha and I. You know, everybody moves, especially when you're young, and it's normal to do it for the first 10 years of your life. You move to job to job to job, and then you buy your first house. But do you stay in that house in America? No, you don't. You move. And so you're not around long enough to start the nonprofit and see it through. You might want to do that, and it sounds like such a simple idea. Why doesn't everybody do this? Well, everybody's moving around like dominoes on a table. You get shuffled around. Somebody got to keep it going, and not often do you have that kind of population. We're a very mobile population in America. Thank you for asking me about Cherrywood. It's a wonderful neighborhood, by the way. I love it. Sir?
How does your nonprofit interact with the neighborhood association, or does it turn out they're almost the same thing?
It started out, thank you for your question. It started out, they were the same. We had 4 organizations in the neighborhood. At first, it was just a neighborhood association, and then they had a little advisory board over the neighborhood center, the Blackland Neighborhood Center, and another little advisory board over Alamo Park, and then we started the nonprofit, and that was the 4 organizations. Now, for a long time, all 4 organizations could meet simultaneously. It was the same people. Because in a neighborhood
same
with
officers and everything.
Neighborhood with no, not same offices. We change hats. And this, you might be the president of the advisory board for Alamo Park, and I might be your secretary. But in the next one, in the nonprofit, I might be the vice president, and you might be the secretary, and Charlie Smith would be the chair. And we changed hats. If you've seen the play, the Mikada, where everybody's everything, okay. You get a neighborhood with only 500 people in it. And a lot of them are working hard, and they don't have a lot of time. And you only have maybe 20, 25 people that's going to have time to put it in. A lot of us who retired do that. That's what you do. You know, you got a little tread left on you after you retire, and the neighborhood knows it, and so they exploit your good nature. and that's okay, but you get the other volunteers frequently are very young. And it's an interesting mix. But those who just had kids, you know, have time to organize and go to meetings. It's just not there. But the business of dealing with the little organization with just such a small group of people, you just don't. You're lucky if you get that much talent in there. So you augment it. We have a way of augmenting our board. We can get up to 3 adjunct board members. So we try to get a real estate specialist, a lawyer, and then somebody that's just plain smart. And get them in there, and they give us a little bit more horsepower in our meetings, and it gives us another perspective. Because I've been on board 29 years. My treasurer is really good. He's been on it 12. Yavola Gavon's been on it 8, and most of us have been on it several years. You know, and you get to where you don't have any new ideas, and you get to use, and that's dangerous. So you need new blood, but the trouble is when you try to get new people from the neighborhood in there, there's not enough folks. The neighborhood association has trouble making quorum now. Over the years, the neighborhood association and the nonprofit have split ways, and it was still some overlap, a lot of the people. But sometimes the neighborhood association will be dominated by people who don't like the nonprofit and want to gentrify, or are highly influenced by that. And sometimes it waxes and wanes. You know, their organizations are very fluidic. And when you don't have any horses in the stable, if you got a couple of fast horses, they dominate the organization, right? And so it's an interesting. There is a third battle of Blackland, and that's just keeping the nonprofit going. And key thing though, again, you got to be around a long time to do it, and you got to want to do it from the outset. You got to have a goal, and in our case, to try to keep a diverse neighborhood. And most of my neighbors still agree with that. You know, it's hard to fight that. Most folks agree with. Some who don't like renters, though, have trouble reconciling those two feelings. And you know the classic arguments about against renters and poor people in Texas. They talk about the property value going down, crime going up, and these are the NIMBY arguments. Not in my backyard, and they're classic. You can read them any day of the in any newspaper in Texas. It's going on somewhere. Some neighborhood group fighting a new development of low-income housing in their neighborhood, and it's just not right. The schools won't have the capacity for it, right? And we wouldn't want to integrate those, would we? You find that some of those places, though, that you might think would be very conservative actually embrace that. And one of the most liberal movements I saw in answers to the gentrification was in Wichita Falls. And the paper really got behind integrating and pulling in this apartment complex. And they did it. And in Fort Worth, in Lubbock, the homeless shelter, the Salvation Army, is going to get kicked out of downtown because it was unsightly. And the Lubbock Avalanche Journal got behind that, and they kept it downtown. So you find that sometimes good people rear their heads and they win in what you think be very conservative places. But in places like Wichita Falls and Lubbock, the scene is more amplified. It's a smaller population, so whatever goes on is more visible. When in the larger places, Houston, Dallas, Austin, there's any given day, there's all these issues going on. How does one of them pop up? It's a nightmare to be a council member in an at-large system where as a council member you're supposed to represent the whole city. You can't know about that many issues. Any neighborhood like mine has 8 to 10 issues any given day, and you multiply ours by 200 neighborhoods. How could any council member know from 160 to 200 issues all over the city? That's why there's a movement to try to get single-member districts where they would actually represent your little area, come from your area, know your stuff, and that may happen. It appears to have a better chance now of occurring than it has in the past. I think they've tried it 6 times, but now we're up to the cups of doing it. But that has a racist history too. When they set that in Austin in the 70s, they were going to be very liberal, Austin being an intellectual and liberal town like it is, and so they designated 3 seats on the council, 1 for a woman, 1 for a black person, and 1 for a brown person. Well, the women over time got uppity, and they just started electing more and more than 1 to the council. I don't know how that happened. And so we forgot that they designated a woman on there in the gentleman's agreement council. I call it the good old boy system because it's just patronage. You get down to it. Over the years, the people of color who served on the council were good people, but their voices were always muted because they knew if they spoke up on a racial issue, the white majority would slap them down. They would not be reelected. So what we found in the case of, like I mentioned earlier, Sally Shipman would champion our cause, an Anglo woman, where Charles Erdy had to kind of hold back, a black man. He could vote with her if she made the leadership, but under that at-large system with the designated points, you have they were good people. They wanted to do stuff, but they just knew in the political reality of a white majority Austin, they better keep their mouth shut if they really had passion about a racial issue. And yet the council, inevitably, when there was a brown issue, they turned to the brown council member, and if it's a black issue, they turned to the black council member.
And neither of them could respond.
And they were paralyzed under the at-large system. I mean, it's a crazy system. It's not a system, but it was good intentions, but it didn't work. It doesn't work. And if you want, after they get out of the council, if you want to talk to some frustrated people, talk to some of those council members who served on that. But that institutionalized racism and sexism on the council is another place where you get the disproportionate impact coming out. It's just another level, another institution.
Yeah.
And it's so integrated into the culture of Austin, a lot of people can't imagine voting for a district representative, somebody that represents maybe a 1 mile square area. It blows your mind. They did it in Dallas under a civil rights suit. They did it in Houston. They did it in Galveston. They did it in Fort Worth, in Lubbock. And they're on their third generation case of Lubbock, where every time they have a census now they have to change the district lines because the brown population keeps growing in all these cities, and it changes the demographics, and they keep having usually brown council members. They have major battles over that. Well, they've been doing those battles every time there's a census now for decades. And Austin is still on its onesies. We're still, we haven't even gotten a game yet. Other questions? Any other questions? Got it.
It's the second battle of Blackland.
Second battle.
So can we
Go ahead.
have that as the last question?
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
You want?
Yeah, I think that would work.
That battle is a gentrification battle. As I said earlier, when we were able to stabilize the land and stop the university, the second battle was just to deal with gentrification. And we've had to create strategies over the years. The housing been part of it. The poison watermelon policy been part of it. Renting houses as opposed to selling, and how long will it go on? We seem to have turned the corner now on the kinds of people who want to live over there. Again, they want to live in a diverse neighborhood, and that's new. So we may be winning that battle. I like the idea, the word degentrification, but I don't think we've done that. We have just sort of dealt with it. And we're not reversing any trend, but we're holding our own. And from what I can tell, we're about the only neighborhood in Austin and maybe Texas that has.
Right.
And so it's an unusual situation. And I wish we were intelligent and had seen all this and had worked it out in advance. We did see a few things. But a lot of it's just happenstance, that we were lucky and we learned as we went along. And had, ironically, if it hadn't been for the university, the gentrification would have hit us very early, and we would have looked like Cherrywood before, we knew it. It would happen, but we were on a political conscious level, dealing with UT turned us on to who we were. We created a community identity. And had we not had that fight, we wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't have started a nonprofit, and we wouldn't be where we are today without that battle, that first battle. But the second battle is a very different one, fought block to block, house to house, year to year, organization to organization. And you look through it a long time. Where will it be in 20 years? I don't know. But that's the second battle, and it continues, And underneath that second battle is that, I should have said third battle, keeping your organization, your nonprofit going, keeping your people aware of the goal, taking care of conflicts of interest, re-educating your board, all the scut work of organizing that goes on and on.
Wow.
Good questions. I appreciate y'all having me tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.